Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Conversations on Dress presented by the Costume Society of America. We are about to enjoy the second part of our third-part series of Ann Lowe, American Couturier, a upcoming exhibition at Winterthur Museums, Gardens, and Libraries. Last month in our first session, we met Professor Katja Rosalie and really focused on the construction of one dress, perhaps Emma's most famous dress, the bridal gown for Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. Tonight we'll be talking with Elizabeth Way, who is assistant curator at Museum at FIT and is the guest curator for this exhibit, as well as Heather Hansen, conservation assistant, and Kate Sahmel, who's head of the lab at the conservation lab at Winterthur, about selecting the garments and acquiring the garments for the exhibition, as well as preservation, mounting, and all that behind the scenes work that goes into putting on a beautiful show. So welcome everybody, and welcome ladies. Thank you so much for joining us. So to begin, we're going to pass it over to Elizabeth, and she's going to walk us through her curatorial process and her research into the garment selection process and the storytelling for this exhibition.
So thank you so much, Graham. As you said, my name is Elizabeth Way, and I spend most of my time at the museum at FIT in New York. But I was thrilled for this opportunity to guest curate this exhibition at Winterthur. And so I want to tell you a little bit about how the idea came about some of the institutions that we're borrowing from, and some of the objects that you'll see. And of course, in the third part, you'll see Alexandra and Kim take you through the exhibition itself. So we're going to start right where we left off with Katja, with Jacqueline Kennedy. So this is by far Ann Lowe's most famous dress. And so I think that this is an amazing entry point into her life as a very significant American couturier. Even though this dress really tends to take up so much space kind of in her life, there's really so much more that we're able to talk about, and so much more material culture that she left behind, both in garments as well as photographs. So this is Ann Lowe. She was born in Alabama at the end of the 19th century. And what we know of her early life is really put together by a researcher named Margaret Powell. And so this is Margaret. And Margaret is really the impetus of research on Ann Lowe, the exhibition, and we really want to pay tribute to her because she was such an amazing scholar, lost to us much, much too early. But she was doing her master's work in DC at the Corcoran, and she discovered Ann Lowe through her intern experience, first at Hillwood in DC, at Winterthur. She continued kind of her internship journey and her research, and then through her profession at the Carnegie Museum. And Margaret was really the first person through her master's thesis to do major work on Ann Lowe and thinking about her legacy. And she really wrote her major biography. And she was actually set to curate this exhibition, bringing together the institutions where she did her research, the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, Winterthur with its amazing lab, which you'll hear about soon, which makes it the perfect venue to host this exhibition, as well as Hillwood. Again, she passed away. And when she did, Winterthur asked me to guest curate the exhibition because I'd also worked on Ann Lowe, research on her since my days as a grad student at NYU. So Margaret was really the beginning of it all. But I want to talk a little bit about the pieces that we have in the exhibitions and the institutions that we're borrowing from. So the most Ann Lowe pieces that are held by a single institution are held by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. But this collection came from the Black Fashion Museum, which was created by Lois Alexander Lane in the 1970s in Harlem, New York. So the first Ann Lowe exhibition was held there in the 1980s. And this collection really grew out of Lois Alexander's love of Black fashion and her really inspiration to document it, really one of the first people to actively collect Black fashion designers at this time. So you can see a really beautiful example of Ann Lowe's work here. As I talk about kind of the institutions and the gown, I talk a little bit more about her style and her the way she worked, the way she constructed. So these handmade flowers, and this is a dress from quite late in her career, so she'd really honed her skills kind of in by this time. But you can see these really beautiful flowers that range from kind of buds to full blooms, and this really became a signature of her work. We also borrowed pieces from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this is kind of the second largest repository of their work. They hold about 10 pieces, and we are able to show a wide range of her working career from the 1910s, really mostly through photographs, but we do have extant objects from the 1920s all the way through the 1960s. And she retired in 1972. So we're really thinking about 6 decades of fashion. So while Ann Lowe is this really fascinating figure, of course, working in couture when most of American fashion is kind of characterized as ready to wear, the exhibition is also this really amazing fashion history from this really beautiful period of the 20th century. This is one of the very few pieces you see on the left that we have of her from the 1940s. This is a wedding dress. And she worked with the bride to create all of these kind of personal touches. So you'll notice on the neckline, we have Bermuda lilies. And the bride, her family, was connected to the island of Bermuda, and that was a very personal touch that Ann Lowe added just for her. But on the right, you can see, again, kind of aspects of her construction style, her aesthetic, the flowers kind of coming up in a lot of different ways, the applique, the beading, even hand painting. She did a lot of different embellishment techniques. So this is a piece from my home collection. And what I love about this one is that it's really so kind of severe and lacking in ornamentation, which is kind of rare for Ann Lowe. But what is kind of consistent with her work is the way she constructed her bodices. So I'll talk a little bit more about private collections a little bit later on, but this is really the way we can identify Ann Lowe's work, is by opening it up and looking at the bodice. So this really works more for her 50s and 60s pieces, but looking inside dresses like this, they're all kind of constructed in this way, which makes it really, really easy to identify her work if these markers are here. And you can see, you know, absolutely working in the couture tradition, using elastics, using waist stays, using padding. You know, there are quotes from her clients throughout her career that talked about, you know, just slipping into her dress, not really needing special underwear, and having the dress fit perfectly and be really supportive. So some of my favorite pieces in the show actually come from the Cincinnati Art Museum. And these are 2 pieces, this is 1 piece, but we're borrowing 2 pieces from the 1930s. So I want to go into a little bit of Ann Lowe's history here to give you a bit of context. So again, born in Alabama, she trained under her grandmother and her mother. Her grandmother had been an enslaved dressmaker, and she really carried those skills into freedom during the Reconstruction era, during the Jim Crow era, and taught Ann Lowe's mother, as well as Ann Lowe, these really advanced dressmaking skills. So her mother and grandmother had a business in Montgomery, Alabama that served the elites of that state. They made dresses for the governor. And in 1960, her mother unexpectedly passed away. So Ann Lowe was about 16 years old, and she was left to finish this large order of New Year's dresses for the governor's wife, for the governor's ball. And this is really when she kind of stepped into the family business on her own. She was married very, very young. We're not quite 100% sure of the date, maybe as young as 12. And so she gave up dressmaking for a little while. She was a wife and a mother, but she really came back to the profession in an amazing way. She was in an Alabama department store. She, of course, still made all of her own clothing. And a woman named Josephine Lee, and we'll see some of her pieces a bit later, saw her. So Josephine Lee was from Alabama, but she lived outside of Tampa. Her husband was a very wealthy citrus businessman. And she was so impressed with the ensemble that Ann Lowe was wearing that she hired her on the spot to be the family's live-in dressmaker outside of Tampa. Ann Lowe's husband, of course, did not want her to move to Tampa, but she really saw this as her opportunity to continue the profession that she loved. And so she took her baby and she moved to Florida. And so she was there throughout the 1920s, and we'll see some of those pieces as well. And from there, she moves to New York City, really looking to expand her business. And this is in 1928. So these pieces from the 1930s would have been made in New York City for private clients. And these were actually made from for a woman whose son anonymously donated them to the Cincinnati Museum of Art. But what I love about these pieces is you can see one of her techniques that we see throughout the decades that she was designing, and that's fussy cutting. So taking the print of this this poppy and cutting it out, finishing these applique pieces and lining the peplum, creating the tee back, lining the hem with these specially cut flowers. So really, really beautiful work. And of course, this is much less structured than the things that that'll come later. We also borrowed things from Nebraska. The Durham Museum holds pieces from an event that she designed for. She created 33 gowns for this kind of fantasy debutante event, and she worked a lot in debutante spaces, wedding gowns, these really special occasion gowns. So we really see her material culture all over the country. At this point, she would have been in New York, and people would have come especially to her to commission big events like this. So we have two of these gorgeous gowns in the exhibition. And I'll point out that, you know, some of this darker beading that you see on this very pale dress, this would have been kind of pink or white, and we've seen that kind of tarnished over time. But what I love about this pink one was that this was created for this special ball. It's called the Ark Ben Saw organization, which is Nebraska spelled backwards, kind of organization of civil leaders who threw this ball for college women to be presented as princesses and countesses. So this woman wore this dress as a countess for this ball, and then she later reused it as her wedding dress. So it really kind of speaks to how special these gowns were, especially by the time we get to the 1960s. There are, of course, many fewer people making and wearing custom gowns. We also borrowed from the Missouri Historical Society, again, thinking about women who are traveling to New York to commission gowns for their debuts for special events. And so this was commissioned by a particular woman named Susan Peterson, and she wore this to a debutante ball to be presented to the local cardinal, so a Catholic organization throwing the ball. But you see these really beautiful, again, applique flowers in all different forms. And then going back to Hillwood, where Margaret first saw her first Ann Lowe piece, which is this. So this is attributed to Ann Lowe. We're not 100% sure that it was made by her. There's some very special kind of aspects of this dress. And one reason we think that it's a little bit odd in Ann Lowe's kind of career is that it was created specifically for Marjorie Merriweather Post to be painted in. So we see some kind of interior construction that is different from Ann Lowe's regular work, but we do know that Marjorie Merriweather Post was an Ann Lowe client. She was really highly valued by Post, and Post went so far as even to run into her in Paris and kind of introduce her to Christian Dior as Ann Lowe from the House of Lowe in America. So that's kind of some of the lore that Ann Lowe kind of was able to share about herself when she started to receive a lot more press later in her career. So going back in time to the 1920s, these are from the Henry B. Plant Museum, which is in Tampa. So Ann Lowe spent really the formative years of her career in Tampa, first sewing for the Lees. You know, Josephine Lee had 4 daughters, and she had twin daughters. Ann Lowe's first job for the Lees was to make the twin daughters' wedding gowns and also their matching trousseaux, and we'll see some images of them a bit later. And then she also sewed for the younger 2 daughters as well as Mrs. Lee. But around 1920, she remarries. She moves to Tampa proper, and she starts up an atelier in a Black neighborhood where she resides. And what's really amazing to me in this research is that these very young, elite white women are coming down to this Black neighborhood, visiting the atelier, dropping off fabric, picking up dresses. You know, she was very much a part of this kind of social milieu of Tampa at this time, even though she was very much kind of segregated away from it socially. But we have 2 dresses here that really reflect kind of not only the silhouettes of the 1920s, but again, this kind of fantasy ball kind of genre that Ann Lowe works so well in. So this piece on the right is for Gasparilla, which is an annual event that still goes on in Tampa. It's kind of a pirate-themed social event in which, again, we see these young women making up royal courts. And so on this piece in lame with the beading, you see a bit more of this kind of imaginative kind of fantastical element of Ann Lowe's work that we also saw in the Nebraska pieces. So I want to show a couple of images from Gasparilla. You can see that they have different themes. I think today they're always pirate themed, but historically in the 20s, they had different themes. You see this Egyptian theme on the left, and it's more historical, maybe perhaps Elizabethan theme on the right. But Ann Lowe was commissioned from 1924 to 1928 to create the court gowns. This was a really big deal for a Black designer at this time. She also spent some time in New York City at Saks Fifth Avenue. And this is where I want to talk a little bit more about the private collections that we are able to show in the exhibition. And the vast majority, I think probably all of them this will be the first time they've ever been on show. So this is a piece actually from the Met, but it's really the key to helping us identify some of these pieces. So she spent about 2 years working for the Adam Room in New York City. And the Adam Room existed before and after Lowe, and they have these labels that you see here, Saks Fifth Avenue. But through this very unique construction of the bodice that we saw earlier, we are able to identify dresses that are just labeled with Saks Fifth Avenue as Ann Lowe's works. And that was the case for this piece. Adnan Couturier has a beautiful costume collection, and he was a graduate student at FIT. He knew that I did a lot of work on Ann Lowe, and so when he acquired this gown for his collection, he sent me photos and he said, do you think this might be an Ann Lowe? And the first thing I said is I need to see the inside, and it is an exact kind of match for the way she constructed her bodices. And this is a beautiful piece that actually is a removable train. So it's been separated from its original owner. We don't know whose wedding dress this served as, but we are able to identify it as an Ann Lowe based on kind of the attribution to the early 60s from this Adam Room label and the style of construction. So going back to Josephine Lee, this is a piece from the Tampa Bay History Center, and this is passed down in the Lee family. And I'm not quite sure if the conservators will talk about this piece, but they did a beautiful job conserving it. And we can see some of her 1930s work. So again, it's pretty rare compared to her 50s and 60s things, but it really shows all the different styles that she was working with throughout her career. But again, thinking about kind of the archives in Florida that we're able to pull from, both private and public, we see some of the Lee daughters. These are the youngest two, Grace in this walking suit, as well as Nell in her wedding gown. So Ann Lowe definitely developed a reputation as kind of an expert wedding gown designer, maker at this time. But what doesn't survive are any of her tailored pieces. They only survive kind of in photographs. So this piece with Grace, as well as the twins, we can see this more costume look, Swiss waist on the right, but we also have these broadcloth fur trimmed walking suits. So it's a real shame, and you know, they might still exist somewhere out in the world, but these tailored pieces are, I think, a really important part of her skill as a designer, as a dressmaker, but unfortunately not extant in material culture. So
Elizabeth,
yes.
This is a great time to interject a question sent from the audience from Carol. She's asked, were these dresses all collected and saved as Ann's work, or were some discovered later, having been collected as part of the history of the wearer or the family?
So it's a real mix. A lot of them were collected as Ann Lowe's work, at least by their kind of initial wearers or the family. Certainly the Lees really kept a lot of records on Ann Lowe. They were friends throughout their lives, and they really held on to these pieces as special to them because Ann Lowe was so special to them. For Marjorie Merriweather's Post's dress, that was definitely kept because of the wearer in her own house museum. And of course the Ann Lowe attribution for that is a little unclear. So it's really a mix, but some of the pieces at the Met and at the Smithsonian, we know were always attributed to Ann Lowe because they either had labels or they had that attribution on donation. So we were always aware of, at least the institutions were always aware of the designers, but I think that kind of Ann Lowe's value as an American designer has increased, and they've held on to those pieces and are kind of marketing them in a different way because of Lowe. But of course, she did work for these elite women, and so these are the type of women who are tapped into museum networks, who are, you know, much more likely to donate pieces and much more likely to save pieces like wedding dresses and debutante gowns. So it's really a mix, but I think right now they're very much valued because of their maker. So Ann Lowe really was working as in this 19th century tradition, making these custom gowns, but she really transitions from a dressmaker, kind of the idea of a dressmaker, to a designer over the course of her career. And a big part of that is the press that she accrued. So she was famously not kind of credited as Jacqueline Kennedy's wedding dress designer in 1953 for a number of reasons, but she was credited as Jackie Kennedy's half-sister, Nina Auchincloss's dress designer for her debut, and this appeared in Vogue in 1955. So this is a really big kind of credit for her to appear in this publication. At this time, Vogue was much more kind of focused on society women, and this was her clientele. But she also had clients, you know, that were perhaps unexpected for a dressmaker of her caliber at that time. But these were really, really important commissions to her. One of them was Elizabeth Mance. So this was very late in her career, but Elizabeth Mance was the daughter of a very prominent Black church leader in Washington, D.C. She was also a very talented concert pianist, and Ann Lowe made her this concert dress, which we'll have in the exhibition, as well as her wedding dress. Now, I love this piece because you can really see kind of the thought and care and personalization that goes into an Ann Lowe dress. So we have this lace applique over almost the entire dress, except this swath of satin. And so you can really see in the seated picture of Elizabeth Mance how this would add a lot more flexibility because this was a dress designed to be sat in. You'll also notice that the bow is off center, kind of so that a little bit of it can be seen at this angle that she would have been at while performing on the stage. So there's so many kind of aspects of her construction that are specific to the end use and to the wearer. And this is Elizabeth Mance's wedding dress. This is a really interesting piece because Ann Lowe really worked at a time where we still have so many 19th century traditions that are affecting the upper classes of the United States, but it really moves out of that era in the 1960s. So debutante balls are becoming much less fancy, even much less prevalent, and we see different fashion trends coming in. So this dress melds these two kind of changes in fashion history. We have these traditional elements like this cathedral length train, but we also see these 1960s elements, the high waist, almost this kind of countercultural hippie inspired, very bold floral applique. It's much more kind of linear than a lot of her other pieces. So she's keeping up with the trends, definitely in conversation what's happening in fashion, but still making a nod to those nostalgic traditional elements that weddings and debutantes kind of are looking for. And this is a beautiful shot of Elizabeth at her wedding with her father. And in the background, the very back on the left side, you'll see Ann Lowe, who did attend the wedding. So this is one of the last pieces that she created before her retirement in 1972. She also spent a period of time in the 1960s, right after Saks, working at Madeleine Couture, and this is from the private collection of Charmin Petty. So Charmin Petty is the daughter of Benjamin and Ione Stoddard, who owned Madeleine Couture. When Ann Lowe first moved to New York City in the late 20s, she called Madeleine Couture looking for a job. She was not able to acquire a job at that time, but she called them back in the mid 60s after she had actually went bankrupt. She was notoriously kind of not interested or attentive to the business aspects of her design business. But Benjamin and Ione Stoddard definitely knew who she was. They had similar clientele and they were very eager to hire her. What's more, they were very eager to promote her. And it was really through them that we start to see the national press on Ann Lowe that has been so invaluable to researchers. So this is a really beautiful dress. And again, I'm not sure if the conservators will talk about this, but they conserved all of these feathers. It was really a phenomenal job. But Ione and Benjamin, they hired a press agent to publicize Ann Lowe, and they got some really significant press. A lot of newspaper articles. You can see, search for them online and see a lot of articles that are kind of variations on a theme, so coming from a press release. But they got her on the Mike Douglas show, which was a national talk show at this time. And this is a picture of Ione Stoddard and Ann Lowe getting on a plane to go to Cleveland to film the Mike Douglas show. It was through this and then other significant press pieces like this article in the Saturday Evening Post where she really starts to tell her story. She's in her 60s. By this time, she's had a long career. She's had eye problems kind of throughout the last 10 years. So she's blind in one eye. Having trouble with the other eye, so you can see her wearing dark glasses, but she's still turning out these really gorgeous gowns, and she's finally able to kind of tell her own story. And that's why we know that she created this gown, which was worn by Olivia de Havilland when she won her Oscar in 1947. So if you're not familiar, I was most familiar with Olivia de Havilland from Gone with the Wind, but she was, of course, a talented actress in many things. And Ann Lowe talks about how she created this dress under the label of Sonia Gowns. So we'd only know this through her own kind of oral history. She hand painted these flowers, so another example of different ways that she's applying flowers. And you can see 47 very much embracing the new look right away. So thinking about her press, we can trace her presence in the press all the way back to her time in Tampa. And this is an article from 1926. So as I mentioned before, she was really known for wedding dresses, for her expertise at this time. She was quite young at this time, and she'd already talking about how she's made hundreds of wedding dresses. But importantly, this press article also pictures her studio. And she was really important in the fashion scene in Tampa because she was training other women. There weren't many women who had the skills that she needed to help turn out all of these gowns, and so she trained them herself. And there are even advertisements after she leaves for New York where women are advertising their skills and their association with her because she's so well known within this circle. She was also sent to Paris to cover the couture shows by the Black newspaper New York Age in 1949. So she is sent on an airplane across the ocean. She goes to all these fashion shows. This is probably where Marjorie Merriweather Post introduced her to Dior. And she also designed this piece that only exists in this, unfortunately not very good picture, based on the couture collections. Another one of her pieces that appeared in the New York Age is for Adela Coke, which was again one of her Black clients. There weren't so many, perhaps more than were kind of advertised, but again, you can see the signature Ann Lowe aspects with the flower, applique flower for Adela Coke's Easter dress. And within kind of the Black press, we really start to see her gain this national recognition in ebony in 1966. So a little bit after the press she got on Mike Douglas' show and in the Saturday Evening Post, but she's really held up as this, this designer with so much experience. And what's interesting is she's really marketing herself as a fashion designer in a very modern way by this time. We can see this image of her and really compare it to images that we see at the same time of Dior, of Balenciaga, of Chanel. She's all in black, she's posing with her model in her atelier. So she's really marketing herself in a specific way that is really interesting to think about when we think about how the figure of the American designer is being developed at this time. So I want to end my presentation and talk a little bit about the press at the very end of her life. We do see a lot of nostalgia for her late in her career, especially in Tampa. She was really beloved by that community. By this time, these women are older, remembering kind of their youth as Gasparilla queens and countesses, and we see a lot of these newspaper articles commemorating her, interviewing people who wore her gowns. And there's some really just amazing quotes about, there's one woman that said that, if you didn't have a gown by Annie Cohn, that's what she went by at the time, you might as well stay home. It was so important to kind of constructing themselves as fashionable young women in this space. And then I also want to mention that we do have a section on contemporary designers in the exhibition that really look at how Ann Lowe's legacy has been carried out in more contemporary ways. And these are indirect ways, but ways that are really important when we think about the visibility of Black designers. So we have a piece by Tracy Reese, and I was able to interview her, and she really talks about how women dressmakers and women as clients are really important to her design philosophy. And she talks about dressmaker details like the lace, like the fit and flare silhouette, things that we saw that Ann Lowe were doing that was really important to Ann Lowe, or excuse me, really important to Tracy Reese today. Of course, she's working in ready to wear while Ann Lowe was working in couture. But on the left, we have a couture piece designed for Bevy Smith for the Met Gala, and this is by Dapper Dan. The cape is by Dapper Dan, the dress by Kimberly Goldson. And Dapper Dan might seem a really incongruent kind of comparison to Ann Lowe, but these are two people who spent their lives living in Harlem, being very much integrated into that culture. Ann Lowe more personally, and Dapper Dan both personally and professionally. But Dapper Dan talks about how, when he designs for a client, he talks to them, he thinks about their personality, what they need in their garment, and that's exactly the way Ann Lowe talked about designing. So even though they have very different styles, they really have these similar kind of made-to-measure couture ethos in their work. Oops.
Beautiful, thank you. Now we're going to segue into the talk on conservation with Heather and Kate. And we spent some time in the conservation lab and filmed some short videos, which we'll be playing in a moment, but we'll start with some questions and to provide some framework. So Winterthur has had several fashion-themed exhibitions in the past few years. Can you introduce us to Winterthur, the museum, and how you became the patrons for this exhibit and exhibition?
I think that Liz went into this a little bit about how we were fortunate enough to have the exhibit here, especially with the the association with Margaret Powell, but she was a staff member from 2013 to 2016, and really initiated us all to Ann Lowe. And after she was here at Winterthur, she went on to Carnegie, and it was going to be a jointly sponsored exhibit there. And then unfortunately, her untimely passing happened in 2019. And so in 2020, we really committed to do this in memory of her, in memory of Margaret, but also to showcase Ann Lowe. And
That's
so
amazing.
for people who are not familiar with Winterthur, Winterthur is a museum that's just north of Wilmington. It's a DuPont estate, and it was founded as a museum in 1951 by Henry Francis DuPont, and it encompasses his house. It's 175 rooms of decorative arts. We have about 90,000 objects. And then there's also gardens that were carefully curated by him and his staff, and 1,000 acres of land. And we also have a really notable library that's used by researchers.
Wonderful. So the first video clip we're going to look at is some of the dresses in the conservation lab and the process that the both of you and your teams took to restore and preserve them for mounting. And a big part of that was the dress forms.
We've had 3 exhibitions, costume exhibitions here in the past. Fashion and Film in 2006, then in 2014 was Downton Abbey, and in 2019 was Costuming the Crown. And from those experiences, we had used dressmakers' forms in the past, and then we also had ethifoam forms that were custom carved. And we wanted to build upon that knowledge and come up with a system that was archival, that was lightweight, and also wasn't as time consuming to create. And we partnered with University of Delaware, both Couturier, who is in the fashion design program, and Brooks Willie at the Maker Gym. And they helped us create these ethifoam mannequins. So we gave them 3 different sizes. We measured the dresses. We can actually, our color system up there, to figure out what dimensions we needed, and came up with a small, medium, and large. And then Katya used her pattern making software to create an avatar that was the shape, that were the dimensions. And so that was an CAD program. She then gave those files to Brooks at the Maker Gym, and they were able to cut slabs. So there are 5 slabs of ethifoam, and we have a block that create the dimensions, and then we use hot glue to assemble them all together. This is a 2-inch slab that they got, and they used a computer numerically controlled router to cut the shapes. And then we get these slabs, cut out the shapes, and then put the mannequins together. And it's made out of ethifoam, which is a polyethylene foam that's archival. It's not going to react, and it's really lightweight, and it's also great for shaping, for being able to manipulate, to change, to make any modifications that we need.
After the dresses are stabilized, it's safe to be able to mount them onto mannequins, but we have to customize each of the mannequins so that they fit the dress, as opposed to the dress fitting the individual wearer. Here the mannequins are fitting the dresses. So with this one, there's the central boning channel, and in order to keep that from protruding, I actually had to inset the channel here on the mannequin so that it just is really smooth. Also, in some of these cases, we had to shave them down or enhance the busts, and also with some of the petticoats, we added petticoats to give it more volume. because originally these dresses would have been worn for just one event, one evening, and we really need to support them for the duration of the exhibit for 3 months. So we want to give them as much support as we possibly can.
First exhibition that we actually made our own mannequins for was down Abbey, and the way those were made, as Heather mentioned, was they were actually cut, hand carved out of a slab of epiphoam or several that were laminated together. And you can imagine the actual physical time doing that is very labor intensive. Katherine Kiefer, a textile conservator who worked on the project, I think she estimated it took close to a week sometimes to make those. So you can imagine, just for staff time, it was very time intensive. So these are, I think, estimated it's about an hour and a half, between an hour and a half in total machining time to make them. And that's not total time, of course, because then they come to us and we have to assemble them and we have to modify them. But at the end of the day, it's a much more cost-effective way to make mannequins because we're starting with something much closer. This was actually the brainchild of my predecessor, Laura Mina, and we weren't the very first people to do it. I should say it was her idea to start to do the project here. There's a textile conservator in private practice in Canada whose name is Gail Minima, and she had done a project, a little bit smaller project than this one, for the government, for a governmental museum in Ottawa, and she published a paper in 2017 on her work. So we really started, it was Laura's idea, and then we used Gail's information, and then we jumped off from there with our collaboration with UD Maker Gym and Couture. We'll see.
Sure. So this is the form once it's been assembled, but then we also are using 2 different covers. That there's a hemp cotton blend. That these are jersey, and this you can sort of see that there are ridges. This really sort of smooths the imperfections, and then we have a show fabric on top of that is this gray. So it really sort of blends and allows the dresses to really shine. And then because all of these dresses are custom made for the wearer, they require some modifications so that they can be fully supported on the mannequin. If they have arms, we use arm attachments, and this is made out of Wonderflex or Fox Shape, which is used in the theater industry. That it's sort of like a polyester film that can be activated with heat, so we can slump this over one of our arms, one of our fiberglass mannequin arms to create this shape, and then we use stockinette to cover them, and this really nice sort of arm side to put it on. And it does the supporting, and it's also really lightweight.
When we originally started this project, the idea was to have them look like dress forms because we were talking about design and Ann Lowe's designs, but we also wanted to do something that was more neutral, both in terms of evoking skin tone, but also in terms of what was going to best showcase the dress. So at the end of the day, we decided that neutral gray was really the best for the project, this particular project.
And the mannequins not only are used for the exhibition, but they were also used in photographing the dresses for the catalog. So this is the catalog. We actually started preparing for this 2 years in advance. And so this is an example. Last year, we mounted the dresses for photography. You can really see how that dress just really stands out on its own.
I think there's a very interesting piece and really informative how technology is helping museums that are often, don't have endless funds to create more customizable and more affordable tools that can protect these garments and really showcase them. Speaking of technology, throughout Ann Lowe's career, many different synthetic materials were developed, and she, as she designed, inspired by the Couture runway shows in '47 and the wasp waist right away, she was also very quick to adapt with new materials. Kate, can you talk about the challenges in conserving new unstable synthetic materials and the connection of textiles and the Duponts who built Winterthur?
Yeah, so we were really fortunate that the Scientific Research and Analysis Lab here at Winterthur acquired a FTIR instrument, a portable FTIR, which is Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, for those of you who are interested. But it's a way to non-destructively identify different types of mostly organic materials. So, of course, we're working with synthetics. A lot of them are made out of cellulose base, so we're talking about organic molecules. So it was really fun to be able to look at a lot of the linings and other materials that were used in the dresses. We found that almost all of the linings in the dresses are made of either cellulose acetate or rayon, which was really interesting. There's also a lot of nylon, and a lot of the horsehair is synthetic as well. It's kind of interesting to me in the context of how we think about synthetics today, to think about what was happening at the time, and also our connection to DuPont. Of course, DuPont invented nylon in the 1930s, and just thinking about how we kind of think about synthetics at this point as being sort of a cheap alternative sometimes to natural fibers, which at the time there probably was some of that early on in the 20th century, but through advertising from DuPont and also World War II and shortages of silk, there really was a push to use synthetic fabrics and for their own properties. And we know that Dior, who was a contemporary of Ann Lowe, was using synthetics, as were other couture designers, and probably for their own properties. If you think about a dress that's made out of 100% silk versus a nylon or rayon fabric, those have completely different properties in terms of their structure, in terms of their weight. So I think a lot of these dresses would have been really different if they had been made with silk fabric as opposed to these synthetics. And surely I think Ann Lowe was probably using them for their properties. They probably also were more cost effective, but she was definitely utilizing their stiffness and their structure as well.
Awesome. I think that's kind of the perfect segue into our next video, which is going to look in detail at some of these dresses and some of the conservation work done.
So this is a dress that Ann Lowe worked on when she was working for Couture from about 1962 to 1965. And it is on loan from a descendant of the business owners. Charmin Petty has lent it to us for this exhibition. And it wasn't designed for anyone. It was actually designed for a runway show. And it has again the seams, the lace-lined seams, and the waist tape that is typical of Ann Lowe dresses. But one of the things that's really gorgeous about this are the dyed ostrich feathers that are on the train and also on the front. And so they have these little bows that tie them into place, and it looks almost as if the ostrich feather is just falling.
I'm Andrea Goldstein. I'm a fellow in textile conservation here at Winterthur, and this is one of the projects that I've been working on. One of the main things that I've been doing is trying to recreate these feathers that you can see here on the dress. And this is a really great reference photo that we have. It's in the catalog, but you can see the feathers originally had a really nice curved, cupped shape. And unfortunately, the way that the feathers are now, just with age and storage, they don't really represent the original intention of the dress. So one thing that's really important for us is to, one, recreate the color so that it matches as closely as possible, and then also to recreate that curvature that we find in our reference photo. So one element of this treatment has been finding a great color match for these feathers. It has a lovely pink, and we really want to do justice to that really great element of this dress. So I have been working with dyes that work well with proteinaceous fibers and what we often use with silk or wool, and it's been working really well with these feathers as well. You can see these are one of the first ones that I dyed, and you can tell that they are much too dark, really not the right color at all. But from there, we were able to get a little bit closer, maybe a little bit too dark, but we're definitely getting closer. And then with each round, with each trial, we get a little bit closer and a little bit closer. So these are one of the more recent ones where the color is very close. And this is one that we're going to move forward with because we like the color match of this one.
So a concert dress, it was worn by Elizabeth Vance, who is the only African American client in the exhibition. So it's really kind of special. And her father knew Ann Lowe. And this is a really lovely dress because it shows a lot of the classic Ann Lowe construction techniques that we see, this fussy cutting of lace. And the joint here, fussy cutting basically means that it was cut along the pattern of the lace and then put back together the way Ann Lowe, the way she wanted to. So she was kind of creating her own designs through these laces. And then you can see, it's really fun to see on the back. Turn this around. It's asymmetrical, which is another thing we see a lot with Ann Lowe. And you can see, because she was a pianist, she was a concert pianist, the bow here is on the right side so that she could sit on the piano bench and the bow wouldn't get in the way of her playing and sitting on the piano bench. So very sparkly, very typical Ann Lowe in a lot of ways.
There are only about 60 dresses that are known right now, but that continues to change as we learn more about Ann Lowe and as she becomes more of a household name.
So one of the really fun things about the Lowe dresses is that a lot of times there's just fun details that are stitched into the dresses. And here you can see there's a little butterfly, a fussy cut lace butterfly that's been stitched into the petticoat. And only the wearer would know that it was there. So super fun.
I'll preface this by saying that Elizabeth put her slideshow together separate from our filming, and I just love how we featured two of the same dresses. They must have a lot of good memories for all three of you. So we have a few more questions for Heather and Kate, and then we will open it up to audience questions for the whole panel. You guys mentioned that the process really started 2 years ago with putting together the catalog. And I know in our discussions, we talked about different authors and different specialists contributing chapters to that. Can you tell us about the process of putting together the catalog and what it includes? I was able to see a copy, and it's published by Rizzoli, and it's just stunning. I can't wait to acquire one for myself once the show opens.
So the catalog it's thank you, Graham, it's really beautiful, and I think it's really wonderful that Conservation was invited to contribute to the catalog. We were able to showcase some of the details that you won't necessarily get to see in the exhibition. There's a lot of really beautiful photos of the interiors, some of the really classic bodice construction that Liz talked about. There's some really nice photos of those details in the catalog. We really started on working on it in January of 2022. That's when we started to get getting the mannequins and the forms in and dressing them, and all the photography had to be done by the end of last summer. So it's been a very time-intensive process. And in the conservation chapter, we also showcase a couple of the treatments. One treatment of the manse wedding dress, which had shown some yellowing over time. We weren't able to return it 100% to white as it was originally, but I think that's okay. The dress has age on it, but it's nice to sort of try to improve upon that appearance, thinking about Ann Lowe's original vision for the dress. And there's also, Liz mentioned the Tampa Bay dress that one of our previous fellows worked on and did a really beautiful job conserving. And there's also details about that treatment as well. But yeah, it really is it's a beautiful catalog. Published by Rizzoli. It's a great picture.
This is kind of going back to the question Carol asked of some dresses being kind of rediscovered. Recently on Winterthur's social media, they announced discovery of a previously unknown Ann Lowe dress. Can you tell us about that and how this renewed interest in her work will hopefully, help us find more hidden treasures?
Sure. This was actually really unexpected because it happened pretty close to us. In Westchester, Pennsylvania, there's a wonderful vintage store called Miss Melena's, and she has a buyer that goes to estate sales and found an Ann Lowe dress. And we're hoping that there's going to be more discoveries along the way because, I mean, purportedly she made thousands of dresses. So they've got to be out there somewhere. And this dress, one of the really wonderful things that she did sometimes is has contrasting color, that you see this in the Veiled Prophet dress that has the grapes on it, but it turns back and there's this burgundy color. And in this newly discovered dress, it's a navy blue dress, but there's this turn back that's bright green.
Wow.
So it's really cool.
Was an institution lucky enough to pick that up, or did it go to a private collector? Do you know?
We don't know yet. Who knows?
It'll be interesting to see if it shows up at your guys' premiere event. That would be very interesting. The last question, we talked a bit about Winterthur being at home, a repository for a collection, as well as a garden and a library, but it's also a place of learning and education. Can you tell our audience of scholars and students a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So, Winterthur, of course, has this amazing collection of early American decorative arts in the house and it's gallery space. But we also have a library, and it hosts 2 graduate programs. There's the Winterthur program, and it used to be Early American Culture. It's American Material Culture now, and it's jointly sponsored through Winterthur and the University of Delaware. And we also have a conservation program, the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation. We also are lucky enough to have a really active research fellow program. So there's a lot of research fellows and actually a maker creator fellowship as well. So there's also artists and creators who come to Winterthur, which really creates a really rich, fertile environment for a lot of wonderful discussions and research and sharing of ideas. Winterthur is really a great place in terms of learning. We also have, as Heather mentioned, a library with a really incredible archives, which is a wonderful resource for all. Just about anything you can think of, really. It's a huge. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head of objects, but the archives is truly phenomenal here. So it's a great learning environment for people in all stages.
Amazing.
Absolutely.
I will just say that the exhibition opens on September 9th and it runs at Winterthur through January 7th.
One more plug is that for Yuletide this year, every year Winterthur has a holiday exhibition in the house that features various themes. This year we'll have some Ann Lowe themed trees, as well as a couple local contemporary African American designers whose work will be showcased as part of that as well.
I'll make sure to have to check that out. That's very cool. One question coming from Karen asks, where are the dresses usually found? I know we had some from major institutions and some more from small local places. And you, Elizabeth, you mentioned that the Met has the 2nd largest collection, but they only have 10, which is what, though, a 6th, 7th of all of the gowns. So
yeah, they're really in institutions all around the country. I don't know of any in international collections, but it's quite possible. There's some in Texas. There are. And I think those are all the only institutional ones that we weren't really able to include, the ones in Texas, but they're in private collections all over because these are really beautiful dresses that people tended to save. So even if they, like the one that was just found that went to an estate sale, they are really beautiful pieces that tend to survive only worn once and then kept in the family. So they went to institutions from their donors or from their descendants, or they're in vintage shops. But hopefully there's still a lot of them out there, maybe in people's attics or basements, or maybe in a safer place for textiles. But we are really anticipating finding more as the show runs.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense when you were talking about how the tailoring just doesn't exist. Like those pieces were made for daily use and might have been repurposed or passed down, whereas something that has the sentiment of being worn for a wedding or a debutante ball or such a fete like they were having in Tampa, you know, what one would put that up and save that and all the memories that come along with it. So it's wonderful that that these pieces of creativity have lasted for up to 80 years, some of them, right?
Yeah.
So I just like to extremely thank our panel for their time and their effort in putting this together. We thank you so much for attending. Questions about today's presentation or future webinars, please email conversationsondress@costumesocietyamerica.com. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.